Good afternoon. So we're going to be giving a presentation on bilingual development in multicultural contexts. We're going to be presenting a general background of traditional views on bilingualism, and then we're going to move on to two sample studies describing what we found when analyzing speech produced by heritage speakers of English and Spanish here in Albuquerque, New Mexico. So some of the benefits of bilingualism are related with the mind and cognitive development, of course. There is growing recognition that bilingualism confers cognitive benefits that extend over the lifespan, and that support for minority language development significantly improves children's academic success. Bilingual people often perform better on tasks that require conflict management. For instance, bilingual people often perform better than monolingual people at tasks that tap into what's called inhibitory control ability, which is the ability to ignore competing perceptual information in order to focus on relevant aspects of the input. One example of this is the Stroop task. This is the example of the Stroop test, and so in this case, the idea is that you have to say the colors, not the words, as fast as you can. And what we usually perceive is that bilinguals are able to perform the task faster than what a monolingual would be, because it's easier for bilinguals to inhibit the influence of the word written versus the color in which the word is written. Bilinguals are also better than monolingual people at switching between two tasks. For example, it can be categorizing objects by shape and then by color, and so when you have to switch in between tasks, the bilingual brain is better trained because it's already trained in switching between languages, okay? And the cognitive control required to manage multiple languages appears to have also broad effects on neurological function, fine-tuning both cognitive control mechanisms and sensory processes. And an example of what the other... So in the case of this task, this would be an online task in which students have to click on the heart and it reveals whether they have to organize images such as these ones according to shape or according to color. So a student who is bilingual or a person who is bilingual or multilingual would be faster at switching between a task that says put the yellow stars in the first box and put stars in the second box. Okay, so going from color to shape only. In the case of New Mexico, we know that 1 in 3 children in New Mexico speak a language other than English at home. New Mexico has a long history of linguistic oppression, which has been marked by severe abuse, which has led to extensive trauma and loss of language and culture that still has devastating ramifications for children in New Mexico. There is a case which is the Yassi-Martinez ruling that brought to the fore the multiple ways in which children in New Mexico, especially indigenous populations, low income, and English language learners, have been deprived of equal access to education. And we included here 2 links, and especially the second one has the development of the Yassi-Martinez ruling, which is interesting because in 2020 it was expanded in order to request for the state of New Mexico to provide access to technology. With the impact of COVID, what we saw is that when it was low-income populations or minority groups or indigenous groups, they did not have access to the technology needed in order to switch to remote learning. So the Yassi-Martinez ruling is one that is still active, and there are things that keep on being added all the time. Initially, it had given the state of New Mexico a limit for 2018 to actually provide the services that bilingual populations needed, because it had already been accounted that the resources and the funding for such help were not being provided by the state. We are representing the Department of Linguistics in this case, and the Department of Linguistics mission states that our theoretical approach provides the foundation for effectively addressing our commitment to the application of linguistics to social concerns, including minority language maintenance and empowerment of minority communities. Thus, the department not only studies and teaches about the structure and use of language, but also encourages faculty and students' involvement as advocates and participants in outreach to the linguistic communities in which we carry out our research. And so we're going to be introducing to you all our Linguistics Lobo language lab, and the mission of the Linguistics department is also embedded in the goals that we have.
So in keeping with the mission of the Department of Linguistics, the Lobo Language Acquisition Lab aims to provide support for minority language acquisition among children in New Mexico in two main ways: to carry out research on children's acquisition of languages in New Mexico and childhood bilingualism. We primarily focus on research on children who speak Navajo, ASL, and Spanish. And we also aim to disseminate our findings among stakeholders, policymakers, families in New Mexico. So all too often as researchers, write our papers, send it to an academic journal who reads it. It stays too often within our academic communities. And so our goal is to get out some of our general findings in a way that is meaningful to the communities that we live in and that we study. Right? There we go. So this is a current version of our website, but the exciting thing is we are now embarking on a complete renovation of our lab space, our lab community, our lab website as well. But this is just the current interface. And we're growing, it's very exciting. So we have 3 co-directors of the lab. Me, Melba Chi, and Jill Morford are directing this lab. We also have Barbara Schaefer and Aaron Wilkinson, also from the Department of Linguistics, involved in the lab. We have a lot of students, and we're growing, and we're having more and more and more. So this is going to grow. But these are just some of our students. We have PhD students, we have master's students, and we have undergrads, and we're getting more undergrads. And our students hail from various departments. So linguistics, yes, Department of Spanish and Portuguese, educational linguistics, and we're actually now starting to also attract students from across campus. So for example, political science and nursing, right, yeah, and psychology. Okay, so these are just some of our current students. Okay, so let's get to some of our research. So this audience is a little different. This audience, you're interested in the details of the research, but what we're trying to do, again, with our research is get out some kind of key main ideas that are helpful and interesting, not only to scholars of bilingualism or scholars of language, but also to communities and to families. So research in our lab finds that grammar is variable, children's grammar is variable. What do we mean by that? So remember that when we're speaking to a general audience, when we say the word grammar, people often think about kind of textbook grammar, right? Prescriptive grammar, grammar that's taught in schools. So what we're aiming to tell people next week, for example, is that different ways of speaking can coexist within a speech community. You can have different forms that are used interchangeably. And so there's not necessarily one right way of speaking. Bilingual children learn their community language norms. But what is taught in textbooks, what teachers might think is the way you're supposed to talk, doesn't always match community norms. So if you imagine an environment, an education environment, a child might be coming with forms that are prevalent in their community, and the teacher might be coming to the education environment with a different set of ideas about how kids are supposed to speak and what they're supposed to learn. right? We also find that amount of language use in the home, it does predict linguistic development. But interestingly, we also find that children can learn quite complex linguistic structures even when the input in the minority language is restricted, which is encouraging, right? So even if they're not always exposed to the language all the time, it's still worth exposing children to the language. So today we're going to talk about two studies, and our goal here is to talk about them in a way that can reach an audience that is not just made up of linguists, right? So you can give us feedback on the clarity in which we present these studies. So both of these studies illustrate how bilingual children follow their own path of language development, and it's not necessarily the path that might be expected by educators or even by linguists, some linguists. The path is a distinct one, and it's really important to remember that when we compare bilingual language development with monolingual development, that can lead to fallacies and even harmful, practices that can be harmful to children, like developing assessments based on monolingual language development and then just applying them to bilingual children, right? Okay, so study one is on demonstratives. So just to put it very simply, demonstratives are words like this and that. Okay, those are the words we're looking at. All languages have demonstratives. Demonstratives are among the first grammatical features to emerge in child language. Languages generally have at least two demonstratives reflecting a distance scale in space. So languages will have a proximal demonstrative if we're talking about things that are near the speaker, right? You see the dog near her, this dog. And languages will have a distal demonstrative to talk about things further from the didactic center. So in this case, the speaker, look at that dog. That dog is running by. Oh. In Spanish, we have esta as our proximal demonstrative, to talk about reference near the speaker. Esa, sometimes called a medial demonstrative, to talk about reference that are a little further away. And if you're talking to someone, sometimes you're using esa for reference that are closer to the hearer, closer to the addressee, rather. And aquella for reference that are much further away. It's kind of like saying that over there. Sometimes these get translated in textbooks as that over yonder. I think that's a really weird translation because we don't use yonder in English very much anymore. Okay, but anyway. Okay, so those are the three sets of demonstratives in Spanish. Okay, so our one general broad question we asked was, do bilingual children, and we'll use this term child heritage speakers, because what we want to highlight here is these are children whose usage of Spanish, in this case Spanish, is mostly in the home, right, rather than it being the majority language in the community. So do child heritage speakers or bilingual children do they behave like monolingual children? Now, with respect to demonstratives in Spanish, the monolingual child language path of development shows that there's an earlier acquisition of proximal forms, esta. So these emerge in child language monolingual child Spanish before esa. Okay? So that's the pathway of development, is the proximal first, then the medial, esa. So based on that, we can just ask, we can ask, okay, well, would bilingual children show a similar path of language development, or do they show a different path? Right? We also want to know, does amount of input in Spanish influence child heritage speakers' pathway of demonstrative development? And if child heritage speakers demonstrate sensitivity to spatial distance, this versus that, depending on space, we hypothesize that children with abundant input will be likelier than children with restricted input to use esta for nearby reference, proximal, and esa for a reference a little further away. Okay? So the question is, children's exposure to Spanish, how will that influence their usage of these two different types of demonstratives? So participants in this study were 19 bilingual children, U.S. child heritage speakers here in Albuquerque. Their ages range from 3 years, 2 months to 8 years, 7 months. And the children were grouped according to amount of input they received at home, measured by responses to a background questionnaire that the parents filled out. And the children were also grouped according to age.
And so for the language background questionnaire that Naomi was mentioning, we inquired on language use at home when addressing the child and the languages that the child would use to interact with caregivers at home. This was, of course, a questionnaire that was answered by caretakers. And then we also inquired on general social demographic information, such as where the main caretakers or the parents, the people in charge of the child, came from, if they had come to the US as adults, when that had happened as well. We based the results on that questionnaire on a scale from 0 to 4, so each question had a certain number of possible points, ranging from someone who said, we never use Spanish at home, to we always use Spanish at home. We labeled two groups then. One was called restricted use of Spanish at home, and the other one was called abundant use of Spanish at home. So any participant, any child that scored between 0 points to 1.99 was labeled as restricted use of Spanish at home, meaning Spanish is not used as often as English in the household. And then 2 points or higher means that Spanish is used more than English in the household. And what you see here is the number of children that we got in each category, which was nice because we kind of had the same number of children in each group. We had 9 from restricted and then 10 from an abundant input background. And what we did with the children, so these were kids who were between 3 and 5 years of age, so we need to find things that are interactive, that are similar to what they do in their everyday lives, which is mainly playing, even when it has to do with learning concepts such as maths or any other aspect. The way in which children learn is through play. So for that purpose, we created an elicitation task. Elicitation meaning we wanted the kids to produce language, to say things to us without us having to make them say anything, so that we weren't doing what we call priming. We weren't trying to make them say what we wanted to hear. So the description, we're going to see some pictures, but basically there was a table with the puzzle, and children sat across from an experimenter with the empty puzzle board between them. And this is an example, so this is what the table would look like. One important feature is that we put a line in between the two areas. So this area was the area where the child would be sitting here, and then me as an experimenter, I would be sitting on this side. And so the idea was that we needed to help the children physically distance themselves from the pieces in order to be able to see if they were saying this and that, if they were saying esta, esa. There were 12 pieces on our side, and then there were 13 pieces on the participants' side. And so what we did was we set some rules, and the rules were that children could not touch the pieces. Because if they touched them, they would grab it, put it on the puzzle board, and not produce language. So they couldn't touch the pieces, and they couldn't reach across the line, mainly so that we would get the esa, the further distal elements produced. This is an example of what the puzzle would look like once finished, and so we would ask questions. This was something that we did both in English and in Spanish. So in this case, you're seeing the question in Spanish, ¿Cuál pieza tiene sus ojos? So as you can see, we have a puzzle piece here with eyes. So the target was for the kids to mention this piece in particular. And when we did the task in English, we did the same. We said, which piece has the eyes? And so they would point or say something to refer to that piece, and then we would place it on the board.
Or both, right? Point and say something.
Yes.
So what do you think you would say? Which piece has the dinosaur's eye? Yell it out.
That piece.
Okay, we ready? Got variation? This piece, that piece. We got both. I love it. Here's an actress. That's my daughter acting out the task a long time ago. Let's see if it works.
¿Qué pieza tienen las hojas verdes? Esta, esta, esa y esa.
After collecting the data, and while we were collecting the data, we were recording children, so then we had to transcribe the information, the words that they produced, and we extracted the responses that included esta, este, estas, estos, and the ones that included esa, ese, eso, esos. So we had the proximal, the closer one, and then we have the other one that is further away. And so this is what we got. So children from a restricted input background, they produce a total of 280 tokens, 280 esa or esta. And then children from an abundant input background produce 306. All these were always focusing on the task done in Spanish. We coded for the puzzle side, experimenter side, and then distal side would be participant side, which would be proximal. So that's how we coded proximal and distal. And what we found was that, so as you can see, we have kids divided into abundant and restricted. Color red is going to be esa, and color blue is going to be esta. And so what we find is that children from an abundant background were producing both. Okay, they had the esta, they had the esa as well. In proximal context, which is where we would traditionally expect esta, they were producing a big range of estas and some esas. And in the distal context, which would be the opposite, we had a majority of esa uses. Now, when it came to restricted input users, these children were producing mainly esa. So both for pieces that were closer to them or further away, they would say esta, esa pieza, or esta. And if you remember, our question was, how does input amount affect production? So how does it affect how much Spanish I receive at home as my heritage language? How does that affect how much Spanish I'm able to produce? Children with abundant input produce esta for proximal reference and esta for distal reference, as we said, and children exposed to restricted input produce mostly esa. So we concluded that what we can see with children with restricted input is that they show a different pathway of language development, and two of the defining characteristics of this different pathway of language development include that there is the less use of Spanish and concomitantly more use of English at home yields a distinct path of development, which shows an over-reliance on esa. So how can this help us, for example, as teachers in the classroom or when interacting with heritage speakers? So what we need to know is that we can apply this knowledge to the classroom. We can use tools such as differentiation, which means teaching students based on where they are at, what needs they have, which might not be the same needs from one table of students to the next one. And that we could develop tasks that instead of having to differentiate for each student in particular, could be adapted depending on the knowledge that we have on the input that children receive at home. So what we are distributing right now is, for example, a demonstratives game in which children have the option to choose different demonstratives as they play the game, which can serve teachers to know, could this student be labeled more restricted or abundant? how do I have to approach my teaching to this student? And as we mentioned, we have two studies.
Oh.
The nice thing is, you want to play the game?
Okay, so we don't have to do that here, but that's what we'll do in La Cosecha. La Cosecha is a workshop format, so the idea is to make it very interactive. And so yes, I think at least help describe the game for this audience, and then what we'll do at La Cosecha is actually play the game, right? Do you want to describe it?
I described it already.
Okay, but do you want to look at it? Take a
But
minute?
you can take a look at the game. And so you will see that actually in the copy that we gave you, there are two activities. The first one is a multiple choice activity. So that is the one that if we are teachers, that is the one that would give us knowledge of, does this kid recognize both words or not? And then in the game, we can see how each student uses the words.
Right, so once you see how they themselves use it, then you pair them, right, with someone who might have a different usage, right?
Correct.
And then the other idea that came out of this work that you did was that the kids would take the game home.
Correct.
Play with their families too. So.
Which is also another way of reinforcing the use of the minority language at home if it's not used that often. So our second study is on sounds production, but the findings are highly related with the findings that we saw right now with the demonstratives. In the case of sound production, we analyzed what usually we call the tap sound and the trill sound. Tap sound would be something as caro, and then in the second case you have carro, roca. So it's the usual that English monolingual speakers might say, I can't roll my R's. So that is the one that you have there. Research has shown that production varies among speakers, among bilingual speakers, as well as monolingual speakers, depending on the country where they come from. So in the case of what we call rhotic acquisition, and so that is the acquisition of this r sound in Spanish, two key points in sound acquisition among Spanish-speaking children are that these sounds are acquired late. So the caro one, children learn it by the age of 5. And then when it comes to the carro sound, they enter elementary school and they are still learning how to produce the sound. There's also variation in monolingual children. So as I mentioned before, depending on the country, we know of countries where the R sound might be replaced, for example, for an L. So we hear polque and things like that. So what we know is the input, the information that children get is varied. It's not caro, carro, but we have way more colors or way more sounds in between those two words that they are exposed to. So in order to get information on this, the first thing that we did was to see what adults in New Mexico were producing, and what we saw is that, 39, so there is a study conducted by Vigil in 2018, and that was with adult population, 50 to 79-year-old people. And so what we have is, this is the carro, and then this is my caro. The interesting thing is that when we see data collected for people who are younger, the sound that used to be carro now shows some what we call assimilation. And so the example that I use here is mushroom. So if you say mushroom, that's closer to your R there. Now, in the case of the caro, again we see that younger speakers were producing this one. So now you should say rich. So that kind of R, rich, which sometimes people define as like the English accent. So if someone is speaking in Spanish and they R, it's called the English accent. What we didn't know was what children were producing. So for that, we recorded children that were, again, 3 to 5 year old, children from New Mexico, retelling the picture storybook, Rana, ¿dónde estás? Frog, where are you? The good thing is that this is only pictures, so you don't need to wait until a child knows how to read. They can produce language with just the images. So we had 19 children. None of them had speech-language concerns, which in the case of sound production is important because at least we know that there weren't any kind of speech issues that had been tested. One of our research questions was a descriptive one. We wanted to know what was it that children in New Mexico were producing, to see if that was showing their background, the kind of sounds that they were hearing at home, or if they were showing this caro, carro distinction. We hypothesized that children will produce a mixture of sounds similar to the one found among adult speakers in their community. So that shift that we saw between the group of older speakers and younger speakers, we predicted that we were going to see that effect in children as well. And what we found was that, as you can see, there were trills. So carro, roca, rana was there. There were taps. But there were also assimilated sounds. There were substitutions. Substitutions means usually o or n, which is also common in monolingual children when they are learning sounds as a developmental characteristic and not as a speech problem. And they were also producing a few of what we call retroflexes. So if we compare the information that I showed at the beginning with our findings, what we see is that these children are behaving very similar to the speakers collected by Enrique Ibarra in comparison to the older population. Now, there's something interesting about this, and it is that the Hills population comes from Taos, and the population of Enrique Ibarra is similar to ours. So it's also showing regional speech characteristics. So what could happen? We have a child that grew up in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and they moved to Taos area. They are going to sound different from children in the community in Taos. And this can be labeled as a speech issue, when in fact it is not a speech issue, but it's just the child showing the sounds that they are exposed to in their everyday lives. So it's the same as with demonstratives. There are some overarching conclusions that we can say. Children construct their languages from the input of interlocutors as well as from their own output. So input is what we receive, and then we have output, what we say. So we construct it from the input we get, building onto what we could call a cloud of sample productions. So this will be connected to the exemplar theory for people in linguistics. With each new experience. So in the same way that you have your OneDrive or your Google Drive, and we keep on putting things, the idea is that we have one piece, and there's going to be another one that we're going to insert. And this is going to create a multi-layered memory of the sound. So each time I hear someone saying something, I am going to store that sample in my memory. And then when I produce my sounds, the ones that I hear more often are the ones that I'm going to produce more often. This leads to the strengthening of some productions, as I was mentioning, and the weakening of others that I'm not exposed to that often. And child heritage speakers of Spanish in New Mexico, like children in any other Spanish-speaking community, will store these fine, great details about each lexical item, each word they hear, and so variable phonetic output is to be expected depending on the community in which children grow up. So why is this kind of research important? Because instead of producing the binary distinction between caro and carro, or following the path of development of demonstrative use that monolingual speakers follow, these kids are mirroring the social linguistic productions of their communities. So we cannot base our own judgment as to progress in a language class or as to what a child is producing on what a textbook says. Because we should be having the social context of the child in mind when we think that there might be language development issues. And there are 3 ways that we can conclude that research can help our communities. One is by replacing preconceived assumptions on what a person is supposed to sound like or what a person is supposed to say with knowledge on local Spanish speech characteristics in order to prevent the damage and disservice to the student that we would be doing if we don't take this in mind. Through research, we can also give educators resources to identify defining features of the speech of their students, and we can give them tools, such as this game, to help them see how to teach their student population. And we can also provide, as we said, differentiated assessment and instructional material. And so if you ask us at the lab what kind of New Mexico we envision a New Mexico that is a place where linguistic and cultural diversity flourish, where children's multilingualism is seen as an asset, and we think that by disseminating empirically based evidence that demonstrates the importance of supporting children's acquisition of minority languages, we aim to address the need to affirm and support these minority languages in New Mexico. Thank you.